Hello, I'm Sophie Volpp, the chair of the Center for Chinese Studies. I'm so happy today to welcome Emily Mokros, assistant professor at the University of Chinese History at the University of Kentucky. Emily was a postdoc at our own Center for Chinese Studies, so it's really a particular pleasure to welcome her back today. Her first book, The Peking Gazette in Late Imperial China, State News and Political Authority, will be the subject of her conversation with Professor Wen-Hsin Yeh, the Richard H. and Laurie C. Morrison Professor of Chinese History. So welcome, Emily. It's great to have you back.
Thank you so much, Sophie and the Center for Chinese Studies for the kind invitation and introduction. So as Sophie mentioned, this talk is going to center on my first book, which is titled The Peking Gazette in Late Imperial China, State News and Political Authority, and it came out with University of Washington Press earlier this year. And to begin the talk, I want to situate us in place and time and to say a little bit about how I came to write this book. So the Qing dynasty, which was a conquest dynasty, ruled China together with outer territories that were obtained by military force for nearly 300 years. To do so, Manchu conquerors adopted existing systems of bureaucracy and government, convinced Chinese officials to work for them, and added some distinctive components and agendas of their own. And this story is really well known, as is the idea that Manchu emperors revitalized governance by developing communication structures that concentrated power on top, placing the emperor at the pinnacle of a mighty surveillance state. But this was perhaps only realized in the 18th century, and it's really an overwhelmingly vertical vision of the Qing state, and a problematic one. If this were the reality, how could Qing officials become aware of each other's work as they did? How did they learn about current agendas, keywords, and scandals? And how could we explain joint political action and awareness, which we know to have occurred? Put in other terms, the vertical portrait undermines our ability to understand the very real circumstances of political communication in the Qing. Revising it has broad implications for thinking about governance, the history of information, and the intersecting realms of publishing and political culture. So at its origin, my project seeks to demonstrate that the top-heavy, surveillance, censorship, secrecy-laden image of the Qing state is really only part of the story. Qing officials had the means to share and exchange information about government activities. What's more, these exchanges were not just conducted privately, but specifically encouraged by the state. Besides vertical channels, the Qing also pioneered the means to systematically share information horizontally, across distances, rather than vertically or as point-to-point exchanges with the palace. So, the Qing wrested back the attention of Chinese officials and elites by sponsoring the publication of a daily gazette that contained timely documents from within the official communications system. Gazettes, the signature source for state news in Qing China, were what Western sojourners call, and is often called today, the Peking Gazette. And the Peking Gazette is absolutely the best known name for this publication, and it's why it's in the title of my book. But in the book and in this talk, I refer to these as Qing Gazettes, to be mindful that this is a term of outside reference. And it also highlights the dynastic political imperatives that lay behind Gazette publishing, reminding us that even with state connections, there was never a single Peking Gazette. So it's fairly simple to explain the contents of Qing Gazettes. They took exchanges between the throne and field officials and republished them, often in a shortened form, after a protective delay. They could be published in print or in manuscript format, and these formats were undertaken in Beijing, which was the capital of the empire, but also in provincial cities where copious numbers of reprint editions were also published. To prioritize certainty within the state's administrative system, matters were not published until the emperor's edict had been received, meaning that even if an official's proposal was in fact the initiative, the final decision would appear first. So here we might feel compelled to make some comparisons to newspapers. Within the history of information, we in fact have a fairly limited set of models for the social exchange of information in print. And newspaper is often thrown in, but it sometimes has limited comparative value. Gazette publishing featured no editors, no reporters, and no opinion pieces. However, the political impact of Qing Gazette should not be measured by comparison to fairly idealized and simplified visions of modern or pre-modern newspapers. Instead, I argue that we should understand Gazette publishing primarily as a project of governance, with important ramifications for political culture, both within and exceeding the bounds of the traditional political community. So my research for this project took a threefold path, and following these paths take us through the book from the early years of the Qing through the end of the dynasty. So first, I followed an archival source base to understand the political function of gazettes and their evolution within the shifting fortunes of the Qing dynasty. I traced their inspiration to earlier dynasties, most proximately the Ming. In the Ming dynasty, the circumstances of two capitals and the institutional arrangements around document exchange and gazette publishing had caused gazette publishing to become quite decentralized. And in the late Ming, so-called unofficial or small editions, xiaobao, proliferated outside of court control. These formed a negative example for Qing founders who saw re-centralization under the court's mantle to be an essential element for signaling the legitimacy of the new dynasty. I traced this and came to understand how gazettes intersected with other distinctive communications institutions and mechanisms of the Qing, namely the palace memorial system, about which I'll say more in a moment. Archival research also turned up a number of what I call in the book information scandals. These are moments in which the mishandling of state documents or information, often involving gazettes, led to political uproar. At first, these seemed to be endemic and perhaps indicative of flaws in the system. But when I narrowed in on the timing of these scandals, I found the bulk of events to occur in the early 18th century. This was precisely the period of the development of the palace memorial system and the Grand Council by the Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong courts. These emperors pursued a more active role in governance and more direct control of their top officials by creating a system for confidential exchanges with top field and capital officials. The addition of a formal advisory council, the Grand Council, consolidated power at the top. Information scandals like document leaks, smuggling rings, forgeries, rumors misrepresented as official facts. These were all symptoms of the instability caused by the transition in communication systems and court institutions. Qing political actors had expectations about what sort of information would be available to them, and they panicked when these boundaries shifted. But after the bureaucracy grew familiar with the new systems, the scandals largely stopped. So I see the scandals not as flaws in the practice of gazette publishing, but as bellwethers of political change more generally. Next, I followed a highly varied source base that documents readers' interactions with gazettes, which ranges from officials who receive gazettes in their formal capacity to private readers, foreign travelers, institutions, and more. Some of the sources that I used in this category include diaries, biographies and autobiographies, diplomatic records, travel journals, and other private writings, as well as genres of historical and administrative writing that borrowed directly from gazettes. Exploring these sources brought me to especially unexpected places, such as on the right, the example of a French missionary writing about Chinese gazettes intended for the French king and found in the French Royal Library. And on the left, these rare Yongzheng era gazettes used to wrap up minerals that a French doctor sent back to Paris in the early 18th century. It's pretty interesting because we don't have any Yongzheng era gazettes preserved in libraries, but we have them here used as wrapping paper. So combined, these two examples make clear the ubiquity of the Qing Gazette, but also suggest its total centrality to official life. As in the words on the right, the gazettes of China are not merely meant to amuse, their goal is for instruction. The mandarins find there the laws, the ways, they see what they must avoid, and the routes to obtaining the greatest honors. So in the book, I demonstrate how both Qing officials and foreign readers of gazettes used information found in gazettes to navigate careers. For missionaries like Bourgeois, claiming that gazettes played a central role in the Chinese bureaucracy meant persuading his European contacts that he and his colleagues had easy access to understanding the principles behind the Chinese state. This was a fairly compelling argument at a period in which Chinese governance held major sway in Enlightenment circles. But as is well known, these vaunted interpretations later gave way to more critical accountings and xenophobic satires. Oops. Here we go. What's a bit ironic about this decline in reputation is that the European collection and use of Qing gazettes intensified even as their ostensible opinions of this information declined. Here we can hone in on the case of the British Empire. The British proved to be by far the most obsessive collectors of Qing gazettes and incorporated the reading and translation of gazettes into every step of their training process. This began with the East India Company, when missionary Robert Morrison, in his side job as interpreter and language teacher, relied heavily on gazettes to convince the East India Company leadership that he understood the whims of the Qing emperor. And on the side, he used his translations in newspaper recordings, as in the Canton Register excerpt in the center. And this pattern would continue over the decades. So later, the British, under the leadership of Thomas Francis Wade, incorporated Gazette reading and translation into their training for new consular and diplomatic staff. And this really intensified after 1860, but it began before. So as we can see in the images on the right side, which come from the archives of the Foreign Office of the British Empire held at Kew, there were transcriptions in Chinese that were done of gazettes. And then on the left side, we can see the translations that were made of these, and then layers of summaries, which then passed into newspapers. So intensive diplomatic use also fueled the active circulation of gazette translations, often by diplomatic trainees, with problematic translations involved too. And these went into China Coast newspapers. They then circulated into British newspapers, and then they were often circulating globally, as we can see in the Chicago Herald Tribune excerpt from the 1870s. So mentioning these brings me to a final and important leg of the research process, which is the material. So I followed a material source base to understand. Oops, my slides keep jumping. Understand the physical characteristics of gazettes as texts, with attention to their means of production, their role in print circulation networks, their changing availability, and their changing relationship to other forms of circulating state and commercial text. This map shows locations where I found gazettes to be held, and this represents, in the different dots, more than 30,000 gazette issues in 15 countries around the world. Dates for these range from the mid-18th century through the early 20th century. These were particularly important for my research process because no records have survived from the commercial shops that publish gazettes, and there are few surviving documents in government archives that describe this work. So the scarcity of state documents, but also the wide variation in appearance and material composition of gazettes that I'll highlight in a minute, convinced me that while the Qing state may have been the one licensing such shops to work with official documents, from that point on, they worked quite independently. So I'd like to now take a few minutes to look at some examples of these variations in format and geographic location. I do have a few images in the book, but they're smaller and in black and white. And so this affords me the opportunity to hone in with some more detail. So this first image is from a series called Tizo Shijian, or Memorialized Matters, published in Beijing by the Gongshen Tong, a late 18th century publisher that was controlled more formally by the state than earlier or later outlets. It's not clear how they were originally packaged because all of the surviving examples that we have in libraries have been bound together in books like these. However, notably, these were printed with wooden movable type, which was also a practice taken up by later publishers, and readers' evidence suggests that this began in the early 17th century. Most studies of movable type rely on identifying upside down characters or characters that have been dislodged. And there actually aren't any that I have found in Gongshen Tong editions. They were evidently too careful. But there's other clear signs that we can see, and I've put a square around some of these in blue. There are shadow borders, which I call shoulder marks, around individual characters. We can also see variations in the amount of wear between commonly used and less common phrases. So for example, the date of this copy from the Qianlong 35th year of the Qianlong reign is substantially more blurry than some of the other characters. And that example, that can actually be much, much more dramatic in other examples. So here I've just placed a square around two characters when you can see a border, a vertical line next to the individual character, but if you hunt and peck, you find more. Movable type is not well known in Chinese book history outside of genealogies, but it was in fact undertaken by many commercial publishers who specialized in the quick output of short texts that did not really need to be preserved, like broadsides, posters, but also gazettes. So next, I have two examples of manuscript or scribal editions. And both of these come from the South, from Guangzhou or Canton in the 1840s, and they were both obtained by Westerners. And they're both neat, but they were also done in a quick scribal hand. And sets of manuscript gazettes that are packaged together today often feature different handwritings between different issues or dates, and sometimes the stamps of paper manufacturers. So the scribal gazette trade involved bringing the item to a copy shop for recopying according to the purchaser's specifications. Examples like these were important for me in framing local stories for gazette publishing that occurred outside of Beijing. Beijing imprints dominate post-1860 surviving editions, but prior to that period, we also have large numbers of Suzhou and Canton editions. So the provenance influenced distinctions among gazettes in subtle ways, such as variations in typography, the types of paper that were used, and even the character level choices of abridgment that were made by local publishers. Now, I'd also like to return to the more quintessential late Qing Beijing gazettes. This was the period when individual shops began marking their names on issue covers, as here on the left, the Zhuxing Baofeng, in the red cartouche, because these were bought and sold on a daily basis. And there were about a dozen shops that split the market in Beijing. They apparently worked together to obtain copy from the palace, but they didn't work with a unified staff or finances. The commercial publishers continued the use of movable type because it was the most efficient way to print the short bureaucratic texts of gazettes. And they were less careful than the earlier publishers. Here we do find examples of things that are printed upside down or in kind of funny ways. And items could sometimes go long. So for this reason, the publishers would occasionally fold out the thin bamboo paper to print, such as in the center image here. So these yellow covered gazettes are by far the most widespread examples of Qing gazettes that we find in collections all over the world. And some, like the image featured on the cover of my book, even had elaborate illustrated cover designs, which in their iconography and featured text affirm connections between gazette publishing and the examination system, which I can say a little bit more about in the Q&A. So we have late Qing Beijing gazettes in large numbers, but also located in disparate locations today for some interesting reasons. First, we have them in large numbers because the British collected them so obsessively, often obtaining multiple daily editions. We have them in disparate locations because by the late 19th century, these were curios and souvenirs for Western travelers to China. Most travelers obtained a single issue or a few issues, and they sometimes handed them out to friends as souvenirs. So an issue was gifted by the missionary D.G. McGowan to the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, for one example. Travelers were sometimes at pains to inflate the importance of this humble and probably quite cheap pamphlet. So the Reverend Charles Burroughs wrote that he had been personally presented by the Xianbong Emperor this gazette when he gifted it to the Massachusetts Historical Society. But Burroughs never traveled to China, and he probably obtained the copy from a trading relative. These patterns continued even as the gazette industry was subject to intense change at the end of the 19th century. So I want to conclude this pathway through the book by identifying sources of change within this industry, and these were twofold. First, 19th century newspapers in both Chinese and Western languages began printing gazette sections in their pages, not at the behest of the Qing court, but because they saw them as inducements to an existing audience. The still extant and in fact growing audience for gazettes can be seen in that even as newspapers published state news, new purveyors for gazettes emerged, such as on the left, a Beijing-based edition which featured advertisements on its front, here for lottery tickets, or the central image, which was printed with metal types in monthly journals rather than daily issues. Or on the right, a Shanghai edition, which created a sort of gazette newspaper hybrid with the set of the day's jottings prior to a crime report. So a second source of change, and one that eventually spelled the end of gazette publishing as it was commonly known in Qing China, was political. In the late 19th century, gazettes featured in diplomatic exchanges for the Qing court, and often in unwelcome ways, as particularly Western diplomats attempted to use gazettes as evidence in navigating disputes, or to ask the Qing court to use them as official mouthpieces. At the same time, Qing officials became aware of the array of popular newspapers available abroad, but also of the state gazettes like the London Gazette or Tokyo's recently formed official gazette that truly were standard mouthpieces for an admirably centralized state. New style government gazettes or guanbao, with a more formalized, didactic, and politically oriented format began to proliferate. And by the end of the dynasty, the standard Qing Gazette had largely become extinct, although it didn't happen everywhere at once, which speaks to the continually decentralized nature of the business. So having described the sources and the general chronology of the book, I'd like to give a summary of the central argument and finally some ramifications I see coming out of this research. So I make this argument in three parts. First, gazettes were central to a project of selective publicity undertaken by the Qing state and meant to fortify the reputation and functionality of the bureaucracy. The parameters around allowable text were flexible, and they narrowed in times of military pressure, particularly in the 19th century. Gazette publishing was in this way a means for control, but this control was less about widespread social control than the specific control of the bureaucracy. By publicizing official behavior and misbehavior, the state tried to short circuit officials dreaming of skimming from state coffers or other nefarious misdeeds. I argue that gazette publishing constituted a form of curated transparency. The state never promised access to all state materials, but in establishing well-known standards for documents that were easily obtained, it promised accountability. Here, I want to make clear that my use of the word transparency is deliberate. In recent years, transparency has been used by everyone from political figures through corporations to signal a vague form of democratic intent and simultaneous commitment to freedom of information and personal privacy. Obviously, these promises are not fully tenable, and they're often not made in good faith either. Thus, the term transparency with regard to the Qing does not entail a sense of democratic promise or obligation to the subjects of this empire. Instead, it suggests commitment to a commonly understood form of openness through the release of documents. I call it curated because the genres and subjects of these documents, not to matter when and how they were released, was carefully controlled, and those controls were well understood by the reading audience. From there, gazettes were produced in association with the state, but in a wide range of local contexts and working conditions, making them examples of the state's willingness to outsource functions, and also examples of the diversity of print and publishing practices in late imperial China. Throughout the dynasty, rather than following a top-down model, the state allowed commercial outlets throughout the empire to handle these materials and to publish them for circulation. Here we find patterns to publishing that are simply not found in studies that focus on more literary or elite materials, or even on popular texts that do not have state connections. This supports a now prevalent view of the Qing state that sees its on-the-ground operations not as totalizing, but as working in cooperation with local agents, largely to a goal of cost minimization for the state. More importantly, it enabled the widespread reach of Qing gazettes. Therefore, as a consequence of the political priorities of gazette publishing and the decentralized methods undertaken for publishing, the readership for gazettes expanded markedly during the dynasty. At the earliest, the audience nearly matched the implied bureaucratic community audience of office holders and literati elites. But by the mid-19th century, gazette readers included large numbers of aspirants to official or para-official positions, and others with stakes in gaining political information, which I call the bureaucratic public, a body that anticipated the rise of audiences for mass journalism around the turn of the 20th century. This is quite important to the story of the dynasty's last years, because it's often assumed that the Sino-Japanese War was a spark that stirred up a massive new audience for journalism after 1895. My research demonstrates that the audience for political news was already growing in the decades before this time. And in the book, I explain this as a function of increased interest, particularly in state or para-state institutions, amid 19th century crises of governance. So where can we go from here? So first, having identified this quite extensive material source base, I hope that scholars of the Qing, and particularly the 19th century, will be encouraged to go out and look at gazettes as sources, thinking of them as examples of what political actors knew about their present day. There has been unspoken reliance on the English language translations of the Peking Gazette for some time, but there's also value in seeing how things were framed and presented in the original, and understanding what came into public view and what could not come into public view. I've developed a website that's linked in the first link on the slide that highlights collections of original source materials. I also wanted to give a shout out to my colleague Elaine Harris, whose publication and database with Brill both present English language translations from the Peking Gazette and are a really excellent teaching tool, particularly for undergrads. Second, I would consider this project to operate within the history of information, which is an emerging subfield in history, and one that has been particularly exciting and dynamic in Chinese history recently. That said, this is a plea for scholars looking at the history of information to avoid conceptual silos or blind spots when it comes to the state. In this project, I demonstrate that Qing agendas helped establish a historical lineage for news, particularly political news in China. However, this doesn't mean that the Qing state exercised total dominance or powers of censorship over the exchange of news. The state urged political awareness and placed relatively few boundaries around the receipt of that information. As I have emphasized, this was selective to be sure. But the point remains that the involvement of the state does not invalidate publications like the Qing gazettes from the history of information. This observation could also be applied to histories of news and information in early modern Europe, which typically favors a narrative that ignores the role of the state, or those looking at later periods in Chinese history. I write in the last pages of the book that the case of the Peking Gazette encourages us to consider ways that state-organized publicity can inspire critical forms of political consciousness. And I really look forward to the ways that the field can take on these topics. So I'd like to end my remarks here so that we can have ample time for questions and discussion. And I wanted to thank you for your time.
Thank you so very much for this succinct and wonderful presentation about a very rich book and a major source of teaching as well as research. So there are so many interesting aspects that you have developed in the book that I thought that I would just focus on one or two questions as a way to get you to say more, and then invite the audience to join us with their questions. So I think that as it's evident in your presentation and as it's well developed in the book, you present us with a picture of how the publication of the Peking Gazette is about the coming together of a court-centered information order and a stage accepted information trade. So it's about these two things coming together that the Peking Gazette becomes a phenomenon. And this is the kind of phenomenon with at the height of it, when it reached its mature stage under the Qianlong reign, this is about the court as the source and the center of information of value, and then an entire information trade developing around it. So I find this this intersection between order and trade a very interesting concept, and I thought that perhaps we can talk a little bit more about this. So you've discussed in the book about how that alongside with this curated transparency of government communications, which is embodied in the publication of the Peking Gazette, there is also at the same time the secret memorials developed under Kangxi and from Kangxi onward all the way through Qianlong, with the Grand Council controlling information of military operations and so forth, considered to be of high sensitivity. And you talked about how that access to information of that sort is a reflection of a person's status in a bureaucratic system that's highly hierarchical. So I wonder if you would like to elaborate on this a little bit, namely that it's precisely this hierarchical nature of this information order, that some information or access to information is privileged and restricted, that as a result of that, it enhanced public interest or bureaucratic interest, hence commercialized or commodified demand, at least curiosity, if not demand, right? People wanting to read that thing. So the information order itself actually stimulates the demand for information, which is then, which then in turn powers the creation and the circulation of the information trade. So that's my first question, which is about the 18th century, the interdependency these two, so that um, so that I suppose within that context, authority, right, political authority of state information, it needs to be performed in public for this authority to become manifest. At the same time, it needs to be restricted, exclusive, and a prerogative for people to access in order for that piece of information to be of value. So is there a tension between these two, or is it precisely this kind of tension that sustained that system, namely under Qianlong? This is simultaneously a moment when the transparency, controlled transparency, amplifies the performance of authority, and the amplified performance of authority stimulates at the same time, right? The rise and appetite for this kind of information trade. So that's my first question about the Qianlong period. And then of course, for the second part of your book, you moved into this whole issue of how that increasingly over the course of the 19th century, more and more foreigners became readers of Peking Gazette. So and then you also talked about the expansion of this readership, which on the Chinese part, it's a bureaucratic community of people wanting to get into the bureaucracy, even though they do not necessarily hold state positions. And then on this other part, it's about foreigners, especially the British East India Company, and then of course other foreign entities in the Canton system, wanting to collect political intelligence about the Qing court. So I find it interesting also in a sense that to the extent that the British began to develop a capacity, not just to read Chinese court documents and do the translation on their own. It's also that over time, they developed this capacity to generate political intelligence about China. And then ultimately from the from 1880s onward, that they acquired this capacity to disseminate their political intelligence or political information about China through public medium. So the result of that is that when it comes to political information about the Qing court is no longer the one and only exclusive source of information, right? Informing not just the British or the French, but also a Chinese bureaucratic public increasingly becoming entangled through treaty port transactions in the reading and production of such foreign sourced political information about China. So you in your book, I thought compellingly argued that this documents the decline of the Peking Gazette. How did the Peking Gazette in 1807 officially ended? And how the Peking Gazette in this late 19th century context, it's no longer read the way that Voltaire would have read it, but rather been read in a fashion for ridicule, to be dismissed. In other words, the Peking Gazette as a text became became a site for foreign critique, or shall we say for a participated criticism with participants who are both Chinese and foreign, for a counter argument or counter representation about the stage of the Chinese court, right? So in other words, in this, again, in terms of symmetry as well as comparison with the point that you've made about the intersection between information and information trade. Can you say, can we say, and then would you say a little bit more, that by the time that we moved on to the later part of the 18th century, we are now looking at still an intersection between information order and information trade, with the Peking Gazette sitting in the middle of it. And yet, right, when it comes to the production or the supply of information, of political intelligence, that the court sees to be the exclusive source of information. And then also Chinese publishers sees to be the only ones managing this kind of information trade of political content. And the result of that is perhaps, would you say that the rise of a new information order in China, or the emergence of a new type of media, that is journalism in China, or what? What do we make of that? That there is such a contrast between the relationship between in terms of the relationship between information order and information trade in under the Qianlong reign and under the Guangxi reign. So these are, I mean, it's again, it's a very rich book, and there are so many different dimensions to it. And you offer us such intricate and fascinating reading of actual examples, right? You've richly demonstrated how that this is a resource for teaching. This is a resource for research. We should definitely look into it far more closely than we have ever done before. So thank you. So these are just two very broad general questions teased out of your chapters, and please take it whichever way you would like.
Well, thank you so much for those really meaty questions that I really enjoyed thinking through. It's always exciting to hear someone else sort of piece together your arguments in different frames, and you say, oh, I wish I had written it like that. But in any case, yeah, I do want to say something more about this 18th century tension and what we kind of get out of it, right? So what happens with these institutions and what types of interest are generated. And as you mentioned, is that what's actually generative of the power of gazettes in terms of the continuity of the trade and the continually reaffirmed authority of the court? And then we can kind of move on to contrast that with the 19th century case. So in the early 18th century, the development of the secret memorial system, or the palace memorial system, is a setup out of the existing communication system, and it's basically a repurposing of a genre of private communication called a personal memorial, which had existed prior, but to include things that were not particularly personal, but rather confidential. And that these were starting to be put in place was sort of an open secret in the bureaucracy. And so one of the examples that I give in the book is the case of a frontier campaign under the Kangxi Emperor against the Dzungar Mongols, in which Kangxi offers pretty clear details of the campaign plans to one official, but not to another official. And so the second official, in fact, goes and purchases fake gazettes, or xiaobao, as said in the kind of expose of this, in order to understand what's going on. And then worse, he believes what they say, and he sends a memorial to the Kangxi emperor, offering him suggestions on his military campaign. And this is just a horrifying thing to have done. And so this case, and some others like it, tell us a lot of things. First of all, it tells us that the folks that are kind of pirating or trying to gain illicit access to information are actually government officials themselves, right? So it's those that expect that they might have access to this type of information, but they've suddenly been walled out, that are the ones that have the resources to mobilize obtaining these things. But they, especially field officials, so for example, the one that I was mentioning a moment ago, one is located in Fujian, and one is located in Guangxi, I believe, and they're very far from Beijing, and so they're totally reliant on these intermediaries or liaisons who are obtaining documents for them and bringing them and basically credentialing them. And so, and those intermediaries are reliant directly on the governors for their positions, and it's kind of a patronage position. And so they'll do anything to present something that their patron wants. And so we get a really interesting situation where we have presentation of things that are basically rumors masquerading as gazettes. And that kind of connects to another point that I think you made about the value being embedded in the fact that it comes from the court. And so we see this again and again in these kind of information scandals that involve representations of official information, that they will take something that doesn't really belong in a memorial, something like a rumor, and nasty remarks about a court official, stories about a monster or something like that. But they'll put it in kind of the visual frame or trappings of the gazette, and therefore of the memorial system, and sell it as such. And so it's precisely the presumed connections to the court that make it valuable, even if it's the type of thing that people would hear every day in the types of gossip or conversation that we circulate around. And so in those cases, I see a little bit of an expansion outward from those government officials who are just desperately trying to get the information that they no longer have access to a broader sense of the news from Beijing being something of value in Qing society. And so that's really a fascinating transition that we have. But what's notable about this is that it's not, the gazettes themselves are not things that are walled off to the bureaucracy per se. So I have a few examples of both Yongzheng and Qianlong saying, so-and-so is using a gazette, he's not official, so what, right? So it doesn't really matter. And so that's one of the things that introduces this type of tension. Now, I mentioned in my talk kind of a moment of resolution, right? The operations of the Grand Council, the use of the secret memorial system became normalized. And so we see a lot of these scandals falling off. And there's actually an institutional mechanism that happens, and we can trace through the copies of gazettes that we have, whereby it's allowable for palace memorials or zoja to be published in gazettes. And this happens in 1737. And so if you look at the copies that folks make from gazettes in their own writings prior to this time, by and large, it's exclusively tea or tiban, right, which are routine memorials. And after that time, it transitions to zoja. And so we can see this kind of mechanism as a way that they've resolved the tension. And it sort of does perhaps rely in some way on the scandal having happened in the first place, right? That the institution is so firmly placed in the communications order. I think that what I should say something about transitions within that system into the 19th century, which I don't mention too much in the book. But it's fairly well known that by the end of the 19th century, the palace memorial system was used so heavily as to render it secrecy basically obsolete and meaningless, and the Grand Council was overworked. And this is a fact. It's not just a stereotype of Qing decline. And so that's maybe part of the story of the decline of the Qing Gazette in terms of the value of the documents that could be held within it. Because it's not to say that, especially privileged information was ever there, but there's such a confusion of documents that starts happening later on that we sort of have a sense of a random smattering that starts to emerge in the 19th century. And that's one of the things that these foreign readers, in particular the British, are responding to. And they're not wrong in that. It's very difficult to find a sense of systematicity in gazettes. I spent a lot of time trying to see, is there a rotation of provinces? Is there a rotation of topics? Is something going on here? And it's really not. And so it's really, it comes in and then it goes out. It's a product of timeliness in some ways, even though they put delays on the timeliness of it. And so that model is very frustrating if you're trying to, as you say, generate political intelligence. And I'm sure it was also frustrating to field officials of the Qing who were trying to do the same when they're looking at the court, right? So I definitely agree that what we see is the court no longer the exclusive source of information being a central problem here. And one thing that we can know is the publication of gazettes in formats where they could be side by side with commentary on their contents, sorry. So that would be example of a newspaper like Shenbao, right? And so I point out that New Style newspapers exclusively, uniformly, published gazettes, and they thought that would be helpful for their audience, and I think it was helpful to induce an audience. But it was not hard for them to also use this material as fodder to write things and to talk about what's going on. And there's internal reference. And so that's quite a distortion when all along you've had things quite strictly packaged, only the text of the memorial, the official communication systems themselves, and then all of a sudden it's exposed to some type of comment. The comment doesn't have to be particularly controversial for people to realize that that's a pretty dynamic interplay, because then you can have kind of layers of interaction that happen. I identified a turning point around the period of the Taiping Rebellion. For one, there's real difficulty in circulating gazettes throughout the empire during that time because of the breakdowns of communications and territory held by that rebellion. Also because of kind of an increased foreign pursuit and coverage of the war, which is pretty heavy, which is really sort of damning in terms of exposing the flaws within the information order. Because one of the big flaws that they start revealing is the fact that a commander might represent a battle as quite victorious, and a few weeks later it might be revealed to be the opposite. And so if that's been kept within the information system without any correction prior, then that suggests that the entire order is in fact flawed and open for critique. So that's a really big problem, and that they can't really recover from that issue. So the last thing that you asked about was the rise of the new information order, right? What happens next? And that's tricky. If we're associating the information order with the state, and we might not be correct to do so, but I do see a state-centered reaction happening in the formation of Guanbao and in the initiative to get rid of the Peking Gazette. Because in that, the bureaucratic officials who want to get rid of the Peking Gazette are not saying that they just want newspapers to exist, but they want a more sufficiently centralized unit that will do better to educate the public, and that will do better to give a sense of the court's central initiatives. And here they're kind of operating in counter distinction to the kind of provincial energies that are happening there. So it's almost like the dynamics of the Peking Gazette with regard to these political and media exigencies are giving rise to new conceptualizations of an information order that could be, but it's not actually one that does come to be, if that makes sense. I tend to see the kind of more multivocal view world of print journalism as coming out of another set of influences, but it's worth thinking about more. And so thank you again for your questions, giving me a lot to think about here.
Those are terrific responses, and then definitely brings out more dimensions about the book. We have about 6 questions here, and it seems that people are actually interested in knowing more about the Peking Gazette itself. So you've mentioned, for instance, right, in your book, that Peking Gazette, the way it doesn't, you mentioned it has no editor, no reporter, and yet it does have an agenda. And it's the kind of agenda that would change with the politics or the political considerations of the moment. So, the first two questions here for you are connected with that. The first question is about whether you have encountered discourses that critically reflect on the selectiveness of the information from the Qing. So in other words, are there people loudly saying the court is imposing censorship, or the nature of this custodianship of information? And a related question is that since the Gazette ultimately becomes something that goes into foreign capitals, and the Qing cannot not be aware of that. So does that change the calculation on the part of the people who were doing the curating of this transparency, is that the Peking Gazette is going to have a broader circulation beyond China itself, or the Chinese bureaucracy itself? So these are the first 2 questions, please.
Great, thank you so much. So just thinking about the second question first, I wanted to make clear, what Western audiences are not the first foreign audiences to obtain gazettes, right? So the Qing are quite aware that, for example, these are received in Korea. They're probably received in places like Vietnam too, although I don't have as much direct evidence of that. And so they fully view them as public documents. The kind of understanding that the British are receiving and using them is initially seen as not particularly consequential, for the pure fact that it's understood as a public document internally as well as externally, right? So they have access to a public document, not a secret document, and sort of so what. A little bit later on, though, what we have is a set of documents related to coastal defense that are included in gazettes, and this is in the context of, I believe it's in the context of the Second Opium War. I can't remember off the top of my head. And basically what happens is that because these documents are brought into discussion between foreign diplomats and the incipient Zhongliyamen, that it's actually the Zhongliyamen that gets the grounds to say, okay, we're just not going to publish any military affairs in gazettes. So there, right? And so they take it out, and this happens around 1860. So yeah, the Second Opium War. It's not that they really were afraid that these were strategic documents that were being put out there, more that it was very annoying that they were being represented as such in these diplomatic exchanges, and they just sort of wanted to get rid of that problem, because there was just this sort of perpetual misunderstanding about how valuable the intelligence might be, or at least as represented. As for folks that are talking critically about the selectiveness of information, that's really interesting. Not really. I think that there seems to be, as I mentioned in the talk, there's fairly well-known knowledge of what categories of information are included in gazettes and the standards for publishing them. So, for example, whereas foreigners are sort of baffled by this idea that edicts are coming first and then memorials, I don't have a single example of a Chinese diarist or memorialist complaining or talking about those. In the 17th century is where we have the most conversation about the categories of information that are included, and that's because of the transition in dynasties, right? And sort of talking about, well, what will be a change in expectations, and especially now that we have a gazette that is considerably more controlled than it had been in the late Ming dynasty. So Wang Fuzhi is someone that writes about the categories of information that are included, but not in a particularly critical way. And although the gazettes are fairly uncontrolled, I would say, and therefore that complicates our view of censorship from a perspective of political affairs. I do believe that Qing officials and intellectuals of the 18th century were very good at self-censorship, and so they were quite careful in terms of their modes of commentary, and so they didn't tend to use gazettes in improper fashion. They tended to copy them verbatim, and then try to use them for fodder, maybe in a private means later on, but they wouldn't be so explicit as to sort of dissect the criteria involved there. That's a really interesting question, and I wish I had someone who was really, battling against the constraints here.
So within that context, an anonymous attendee would like to know if you've come upon anything in the Peking Gazette which specifically document a Chinese emperor's response to British invasion. I suppose you would, right? But please.
Yeah, actually, so I just with my East Asian history class, we just did a big simulation about the Opium War, and if you read Lane Harris's Reader of Peking Gazette translations, there's a chapter on it, and you'll find edicts from the Daogong Emperor that are talking about the Opium Crisis and the Opium War, and so those were published in Peking Gazettes. To what extent they were, I'm not really sure. That's not a period for which we have large numbers of original gazettes, more these translations. But the East, or the successors to the East India Company at this time, were very eager to obtain that type of information. So I would find it fairly easy to find it if you look through newspapers of that period.
Right. So there are two questions about bureaucratic public. The first question is simply, would you please elaborate what's a bureaucratic public? How are they distinct from or overlapping with other types of publics? And how does your study contribute to or revise existing literature on the evolution of the public, in quote mark, right? What is the public? So that's one question. Another question from Anatole Class, whom you might have met before. He wants to know, did the rise of a bureaucratic public exert any kind of commercial demand on the Peking Gazette? Can we track changes in the form or content over time that correspond to increasing commercialization? And is it a linear trend over the late imperial period? Is that too many sub-questions?
No, that's fine.
Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start with bureaucratic community, and that'll help me bridge to talking about bureaucratic public. So when I say bureaucratic community, I mean the group of officials who are both allowed to memorialize to the throne and so therefore they are the ones writing to the emperor, but also the ones reading, right? And that's really who we see concentrating in terms of readership in the 17th and 18th centuries. So notably, that doesn't include district local magistrates, right? They can't memorialize the throne. They have to go through superiors at the provincial level, and they don't have particularly expansive reason to read gazettes. Their affairs, they're much more busy with handling lawsuits and things like that. And so when I say bureaucratic public, then now we are talking about those figures, but they're not necessarily reading as kind of their on-the-job responsibility, but more in their sort of self-imagination as political actors and folks with careers. And so then we're also including people that are down the ladder in terms of metropolitan functionaries. So these are people that have these kind of student positions or almost intern positions, supernumerary positions, right? And none of them have, some of them don't have salaries, they don't have a status in the nine rank system, but they have some sense of promise for the future. They anticipate that sense of promise. And then this can also include legal secretaries, political secretaries, folks that are informing people that are much more politically powerful. Finally, then that can include people that aspire to those types of positions, right? So we've already described things that are coming quite a bit outward from the kind of 1,000 or so, high officials. But then it's folks that see the possibility to incorporate themselves in new administrations, and particularly after the Taiping Rebellion, in the types of bureaus that are proliferating, people that have managed to purchase degrees or purchase eligibility to a post, which is a really large category in the 19th century. And what I found in my research is that this could extend even to illiterate city dwellers who try to obtain gazettes as a marker of status and a way of associating themselves with the government system. So to me, the diversity of roles there is what helps constitute this as public. So they have a variety of motivations there, but they're all in some ways built around association with the bureaucracy, whether formal or imagined. So in terms of other forms of public, right, that's a tricky question, right? So it would depend if we were talking about that in terms of audiences, right, in terms of public or constituted by the state, right? So I think I'm most comfortable defining it in terms that I've just mentioned, in terms of the kind of sense of real or imagined connection to the bureaucracy, rather than a comparative sense that might be used in different fields. Turning to the other question about commercial demand and changes in formats and whether this is linear, that's a really fascinating question, and one that I struggled for a long time to answer. So what I saw are kind of fits and stops, and it's probably different. We have the most information from Beijing, and so I have a Beijing centered narrative here, but it probably has a little bit more going on if we look outward. So we have commercial management in the early dynasty by a few different shops, most of whom has some association with the examination system and printing for it. We then have a period in which the Qianlong court tries to consolidate and more strictly supervise the publication. It's not built into the palace, it's still a commercial endeavor, but they put officials basically on the grounds. And so that's when there's actually one publisher in Beijing, and this is about 60 years between 1760 and 1820. That was the Tizo Shijian that I showed. After 1820, we see kind of a slow leak where a few more shops are opening, and I'm not exactly sure what happens there, but the Gongshen Tang moves to Liulichang, and so it's one symbol that it's moving into kind of a more commercial print industry. And then by the 1850s, we've got 4 or 5 shops. And then after 1860, we have at least 10 at any one time. So that really maps pretty clearly onto the expansion of a bureaucratic public or audience that I saw, where the real growth is after 1850, 1860. Some of the marks that I can see of commercialization are the types of illustrations on the covers that don't exist in earlier editions. The printing is much sloppier. I think it's done in quicker fashion and probably by less practiced individuals. They're rented and sold on the street. We have some evidence of that. So pretty, not linear per se, but matching the types of increase in audience interest.
Terrific. So in a way, you might have anticipated this next question, which is also about audience. So thank you for a very rich presentation. Could you please say more about the way the Qing gazettes interacted with the civil service examination system, especially along the axes of court centralization and local information trade? So you talked about the, yeah, please.
Yeah. This is really interesting. So folks that think about the culture of the exam system may know that the term for Peking Gazette, Jingbao, is also used for an announcement that you receive when you've done well in the examinations. And it's kind of like presented to you by a herald on this ornamented paper, and then the heralds all demand tips, right? And so, especially at the provincial level, what we see is that some of the same guys that are managing those gambits or schemes are also managing Gazette publishing, and there's a real overlap there. They're sort of like the print shops or the tradesmen for government needs, or the local provincial yamen that's happening. Another interesting point of intersection, and I have to say that my comments on this are not as systematic as I'd like them to be. I didn't find any kind of smoking guns in the archives that told me about intentionality with these intersections. But in the 18th century, we see a lot of copies of exam questions that are reprinted in gazettes, and I don't see those as commonly later on. And so to me, that suggests a period in which making sure that the transparency, right, of the exam system, the post hoc transparency, right, so the fairness of it, are affirmed by disseminating these questions. And so everyone knows what questions were asked. And this is done for every province all around, right? And so they say, well, here's the poetry question, and here's the 4 books question, and so on. And so that's a really interesting set of accountability that suggests that the civil exam system, as we know, is a source of problems. It's a complex system. It's this sort of entry point of personnel, and so it's a source of it's a place where corruption can happen, forgery, and so on. And so it's a place where the Qing are particularly invested in forms of publicity to prop up its legitimacy. Why they stop doing that, I'm not exactly sure. And then the third thing that I just mentioned is that the illustrations that were found in the late Qing, often the slogans that are printed. So on my book cover, there's a sash that's being held, but there's no text in it. The publisher took it off. But if you had the text, it would be a slogan that says, wishing you well in the examinations, basically. And so there's a clear, association here with the pursuit of official status and position. So those are 3 kind of disparate points of connection, but really fascinating ones.
Thank you. So, Emily, we've got about 14 minutes left, and you still have 4 questions. Just want you to know. So, Stacy would like to congratulate you and thank you for providing this rich resource that's so helpful for teaching. She wants to ask about the literary qualities or tone of the Gazette, namely that although the stated goal of providing information means it should sound dispassionate, Still, were there other undercurrents? Did you detect other literary tone, or did they change over time in terms of perceived audience? And then, of course, especially when a wider bureaucratic public joined the readership, please.
That's a fascinating question, Stacy. Thank you for that. That was beyond the scope of my project, really. Like I did far less reading of gazettes than I did sort of figuring out how they fit in. It was simply too much material for me to get at. However, I will say I can't comment on a sort of a long-term transition in reaction to the kind of 19th century growth. But in the period when we see the more kind of constrained diplomatic bureaucratic community operating, there's a clear interplay with folks that know who else is reading things. And so this is where we kind of have like catchphrases and slogans that emerge. So in the book, I give an example of a dispute between the 18th century officials Sun Jiagan and Fang Bao about alcohol prohibition or prohibition of distillation in order to preserve grain. And they are clearly aware of each other's arguments, but they suggest that they've only read them in gazettes, and then they sort of use that as a rhetorical device to make an appeal to this kind of, to the emperor and to the wider public. It's a really interesting little exchange that they have. And I think there are many more like that could be found. Their contemporary Chen Hongmo actually made a comment about this in a letter. He said that, you know, this is where any student of the Qing government can find, I don't remember his words exactly, but basically the currents of the state, right? And so he was himself acknowledging that, you know, this is where we find these sort of agendas and catchwords that come up. And so I did a little bit of work to think about things that end up becoming really prominent. So, you know, a really good example from the late Qing would be like the phrases about self-strengthening, right? Which don't exist, and then all of a sudden they're everywhere. I found some that I looked at in the Daogong era around a phrase about strategic communication or information weaknesses. And they really do explode once they're published there. So there's a sense of refraction that happens. But I'll leave it to someone else to kind of explore the literary merits of official writing.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So the next question, right? You mentioned something about documentary authority, right? In your book, it's a concept about this curated transparency. So the next question is about the seeming paradox between the authoritative part of these documents and the somewhat commercialized nature of the circulation dissemination process itself. So the questioner would like to know, that is, the Qing court seems to have outsourced so much of the publishing and transmission process to third parties, and yet still expected the gazettes to transmit only reliable and sanctioned news. So is there a contradiction there?
Yeah, I don't think that there is. I mean, so the folks that are doing this work, they make money for it. They're not officials themselves. Why would they want to risk their positions by changing the material that they receive? Often that's presented to them without context, right? They're copy shops. They're Kinkos. They're not the Huffington Post, right? So our kind of sense of their self-possession is a little bit affected by our assumptions about this kind of sense of conflict. Another thing about it, though, is that I think that, you know, gazettes are kind of the tip of the iceberg here, but actually this is a sort of broadly accepted practice for things that need to get out, but that we might assume to be more protected. So one good example are literary texts that the court orders everybody to read. This happens a lot in the 18th century, right? So, you know, so-and-so's poems, or this treatise, right? The Yongzheng Emperor's treatises, or the sets of edicts that he releases, right? And often what they do is they send kind of a model to the provincial capital, and then they tell the governor to have this reprinted on the local level. So this kind of like branching circulation that happens is not unique to Gazette publishing, although it's certainly most dominant and consistent and daily in Gazette publishing.
So the next question here is actually about how expensive or how inexpensive for anybody to access the Gazette. And the question is, would wealthy individuals outside of the state structure have access to this thing?
Yes, they could certainly access them. That would not be a problem. They were usually cheaper if sold in the print edition than the manuscript edition, which tended to be of higher quality reproduction or higher quality paper. There's lots of examples out there, right? So let's see, a few copper coins per day, a few hundred per month, especially if you subscribe. Some shops would take back your copies and rebind them or put them into nice enclosures at the end of the year. So affordability, one of the examples that I give in the book in terms of comparison is that a Gazette subscription for a month would be about an opera seat, a cheap seat at the opera in Beijing in the late 19th century. So not for everybody, but certainly not a problem for many.
So the final question here is from Ren He, and he wants to know that since you use diaries, right, as a way to assess readership, he says, can you speak a bit more about your use of Qing diaries and perhaps how they helped to further elucidate the significance of the Gazette for the emerging bureaucratic public?
Yeah, thank you, Ke. So diaries were a great source for me and one that I really enjoyed working with. The main way that I looked for diaries was I looked at the diaries that were included in the Airusheng erudition database. It's within the genealogy section, and they basically reprinted the entirety of a very large collection that was put out from Beijing called Songshu, right, or Songchang. And most of those diaries I wouldn't really consider to be private documents per se, and that's something that I had to work with for a while. Creating a diary, especially for an official, was a pretty performative act. Often it would be the basis for a nianpu, right, and maybe a nianpu that was created by another person later on, right, a son or somebody else. So there's an interesting thing happening here where sometimes these are sort of private records, but a lot of times they're either kind of tools for one's sort of daily life or representation of one's official career. So when I looked at diaries, the most common thing that I found in the diaries was someone recording the official notice they received in a Gazette that they had been promoted and moved to a new post, right? And so it's kind of this legitimate notice so that those that make my biography later can have this fine form, right? There are obviously, though, people that use them much, much more extensively, but they were always quite careful, right? They always maintained the formatting conventions of official documents. They almost always wrote about them in verbatim and then added some comments rather than sort of just commenting on the things that happened. So there's a sense of interplay, and there's a sense in which the document retained its authority as part of the information order or as an authoritative, even as it's recopied, which is a really sort of fascinating thing. And I think the performativity really has a fascinating amplification in the late Qing, because Sun Guofan, who keeps many diaries of his own, which are kind of quirky diaries, he writes that, you know, for any aspiring official, reading gazettes every day and marking them up and copying stuff down is the best thing that you can do, and you can get all the sort of basics of governance. And lots of people read this and they say, that's what I'll do. And so then all of a sudden they're all doing it and actually sort of mimicking this action. And so there's kind of a performance of the model governor, if you will, that's happening in their use. So I thought that was really, really fascinating, because it shows us kind of a transition from an earlier moment where your reading is actually much more attuned to your personal and private politics. And in my chapter on this, I start with the example of Gu Yanwu, who really is reading gazettes and part of a personal project of thinking about the fall of the Ming and the rise of the Qing. But by the 19th century, it's sort of a documentary practice. It's part of careerism. It's part of, imagining yourself with connection to the bureaucracy.
Thank you, Emily. So we still have 3 minutes. So maybe if I could invite you to offer your wrap-up reflections on something which you brought up actually in the final chapter of your book about the Taipings. So on the whole, right, in your book, with your research of the Peking Gazette, you've given us a picture and understanding of Imperial China as a political nation that with an informed bureaucracy, sharing a lot more information with a certain degree of transparency and regularity, right? Far more so than historians have generally assumed to be the case under Imperial China. And then here you go as you reach the Taipings. What is your assessment? Are you happy or unhappy about the extent to which this kind of political information gets shared? But in the event of a potential attack on the city of Beijing itself, when the Taipings were on the march. So based on your research and your assessment, do you think that the Qing information order, even without the British or the Japanese disrupting it in any way at all, do you find the Qing information order operating in such a way as to provide enough or sufficient information for the authorities, responsible parties in the city, such as Beijing, to defend themselves in the event of a potential march of the Taipings on the city?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, and one that I've been exploring in some research that I've been doing on Beijing's position in the Taiping Rebellion and mid-century wars. And so what I found is that the situation in Beijing in 1853, when the Taiping Northern Campaign happened, was quite confused and was quite rumor dependent, and that pretty much no one was looking at gazettes for source of information from the South because it wasn't forthcoming. Because it had to come to Beijing first in order to be published in gazettes. So that made them really problematic if we're thinking about the Yangtze Delta, but it also makes it problematic if we're thinking about the hinterlands of the border areas of Zhili and Shanxi and Shandong, which is where the Taipings were in camp for a long time. So they end up looking to more local sources, and that ends up being a problem. What I see the Qing doing is trying to mobilize gazettes in a different way, looking outward for Beijing. So they start trying to frame Beijing as a imperial bulwark that can be a model for other cities that need to be retaken or need to defend themselves. And so there's a sense in which they are still continuing to kind of use this as a tool of outward publicity rather than information gathering, which I think is consistent with kind of the mission of gazettes. And we see that to such a granular sense that they're actually talking about street level crime and arrests in Beijing, which I never see in earlier cases. And so there's a real signaling that this is a safe city. It's one that's well policed, and it's going to be one that is, protected. And so they can only hope that this signaling actually reaches audiences further afield. That's something I'll have to think about a little bit more. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Terrific. So a research for us to look forward to.
Right.
Let's give the mic screen back to Sophie.
Oh, thank you so much, Emily and Wen-Hsin. This was such a fascinating conversation. And Emily, I can't help but think that your students are really fortunate. So thank you again, Emily and Wen-Hsin. Good night.